Jeremy, please come on up and take the stage, and thank you again for your time.
Thanks again, Pat. I'll keep my initial remarks really brief because you've already had a full dose of listening to the experts up on the screen. I tend to think that the discussion of China, both politics and business in the United States, tends to be a little bit too excitable, and it sort of goes both ways in the sense that it seems to swing from this idea that, you know, the Chinese are coming to eat our lunch, and oh, look at LaGuardia and JFK compared to the Beijing and Shenzhen airports, and we're doomed, and America's in decline, and these horrible communists are going to, you know, take our stuff. To something that you've seen a lot more of in the last few months with the stock market shenanigans and the sort of Chinese government apparent ineptitude in dealing with the renminbi, where suddenly it's like, oh, you know, it's all, the emperor doesn't have any clothes, it's all fake, the Chinese economy is doomed. And it's quite rare to sort of have a saner voice in the middle, which is that, you know, from my point of view, this was never going to necessarily be the Chinese century. China remains, in the words of the writer Susan Shirk, a fragile superpower. It's big and rich and important now, but it's very fragile. You know, a lot of institutions in the country, society, rule of law are very, very weak. You know, you still do have President Xi Jinping sending his daughter to school in the United States. She was at Harvard. You know, there's a reason for that. But on the other hand, it's not all just a pack of lies. You know, I've been to every province in China except for Hainan Island, and people do in fact work hard all over the country. There's people farming, there's people building stuff, there's people making companies. It's not just some kind of stock market game that the Communist Party have cleverly found a way to rig. This is a genuine economy that is built up on, you know, a famous work ethic that is a real thing. So, you know, it can be difficult, I think, to just keep a cool head when thinking about China. And it's not also helped by there's quite a lot of disinformation about, I mean, even the presentation we just watched, there was talk of the TPP and how, in fact, it wasn't designed to exclude China, and in fact, maybe, you know, there were these sort of diplomatic words about how China would come on in, and whereas in fact the truth is that part of it was designed to exclude China. I mean, it was very pointedly did not include China. One of the things that has been leaked about the contents of the TPP is a set of agreements about the internet and about how signatories would have to basically guarantee an open flow of information. Now, this is something that we've seen, like in recent years in China. The Xi Jinping government has made a very, very explicit fight back against the notion that the internet should be open. And there's this concept that the Chinese government is using of internet sovereignty, which they are enunciating with a great deal of confidence that never used to be around. They are not going to sign any agreement that means that they have to keep the internet open in China. That's just not going to happen, you know, at least not in the next few years. No way. And often in the US-China relationship, political and business, you know, the hard facts where there are real disagreements kind of get elided over and people don't really necessarily talk about them. That's just kind of the way it is. So one does always have to be careful. There's a lot of sort of misinformation and disinformation about too. So I will end my little prepared remarks there, and I would like to take some questions.
Has there been much Chinese investment in the U.S. in the internet industry? And if so, how might that impact, if at all, the internet industry back in China?
That's a really interesting question. I mean, I don't think anything significant enough has yet happened to really, you know, affect the sort of the balance between Chinese and US internet companies. I think Chinese internet companies are going to have a really tough time in the United States because they're not used to operating on a level playing field, and the skill set you need here is just completely different from what you need in China. And I think you can already see some of the disappointments, like with Alibaba's sort of, after going public, they're sort of not very good share price, and they seem to be acquiring all kinds of things in a not particularly coherent strategy. I mean, it's not going to be very easy for these Chinese tech companies here. Ultimately, that may give some leverage to the American technology business if you have enough Chinese investment here, but I think it'll be a long time before that happens.
How does the relationship between Chinese and American business affect social entrepreneurship in both countries?
It's difficult in China right now. The government is very suspicious of social anything, especially if you're an American. There's a great fear of NGOs being used as a sort of fifth column to destabilize the country, and it's putting a lot of stress right now on people trying to do socially engaged activities, and I think that includes business.
Can I ask a question about the environment, both the business environment and the environment? Recently, the U.S. and China concluded a deal on climate change, and then before his visit to Washington, President Xi announced the cap and trade arrangement within China. Can you talk about the impact of climate change measures on the economy and your personal experience dealing with the environment in Beijing?
Sure. I mean, Beijing is famously, pretty polluted. So I'm still getting used to the idea of not checking the air quality readings every morning when I wake up in Nashville. I think the other day here it was like 49 or something, and somebody on the radio was complaining about it. And in Beijing we'd be like, oh yeah, we got off today. I think for a long time environmental issues in China were very much a second consideration for the government and most people when compared to economic development. And you often hear, as you still do, people saying, well, you've got to develop the economy first, and that's just the price you pay. But the last few years, I think there is an awareness of the price, at some point might be too great. And certainly in Beijing, this started with the air pollution. Sometime in the last few years, you kind of hit a tipping point with both educated Chinese people, urbanites, and the government, where there was this realization that this is bad and we have to do something about it. And you don't have the kind of toxic debate about climate change that you have in the United States. I mean, people generally think that if you can stop pollution and emissions, you should. It's not politicized in the way it is here. And one of the advantages of an authoritarian government is you can do things sometimes that are more difficult in a democracy. So, I mean, on a very temporary level, you see Beijing when there's a big event, like the recent military display or the APEC meeting last year, the government can basically just shut down all heavy industry in Beijing and surrounding Hebei, drastically reduce the number of cars on the road, and hey presto, beautiful blue skies. So I think if the Chinese government sets their mind to cleaning up the environment, things are going to happen, and that does seem to be the case now. So it's not possible to stop it, without stopping economic growth. But I think that they are making sensible measures, and I think that's an opportunity for American business.
Maybe we'll take one more, and then anybody who has questions can follow up at the end afterwards. Jeff?
I took some graduate students to Shanghai and Beijing last spring, and we visited a number of factories. And the theme I kept hearing was labor costs, how expensive it was getting to operate in those cities, and that they were going to have to continue to move plants and factories further into western parts of China. Do you think at some point we're going to see FDI begin leaving China, or do you think we're just going to see it shift into higher technology kind of jobs and industries?
I think you're already seeing some of it leave. I mean, and you can even see the effects of, on products you buy in the US now, like clothes. I mean, for a while you pretty much couldn't buy a sneaker or an item of clothing that wasn't made in China, whereas there's a lot of investment now in Southeast Asian countries, and, which would have just a few years ago gone to China. So I think that's already happening. There's quite a lot of talk of that. Some of the research projects I've been involved with recently for companies have been along those lines, and I think it's pretty clear that China's not the obvious answer for low-cost manufacturing anymore. But that said, for a lot of types of products, like many electronic products, to set up what you have in China now in another country, the combination of plant, factories, transportation infrastructure, and a big enough workforce, including semi-skilled or skilled laborers, China's already got so much of that set up that there's a certain amount of that manufacturing-related FDI that's kind of locked in because it's just too difficult to do it somewhere else.
All right, terrific. If anybody has more questions, please see Joanne.